Przyjemność powitać w Bibliotece Narodowej, w miejscu, które dla większości z Państwa jest znane, bezpieczne i otwarte. Bardzo serdecznie Państwa witam na nieoficjalnym rozpoczęciu roku Herberta. Oficjalne będzie jutro.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the National Library in Warsaw. And now, without further ado, I want to hand it over to Maria Dzieduszycka, the president of the Zbigniew Herbert Foundation. We are pressed for time. The poets are standing. We need to hand it over to the poets as soon as possible, so welcome.
Dobry wieczór. Ja bardzo dziękuję doktorowi Tomaszowi Makowskiemu za przedstawienie mnie.
Good evening, and thank you very much to Dr. Tomasz Makowski for the introduction. I want to begin with a word of thanks. The National Library has been our strategic partner as the co-organizer of the Herbert Centennial, which we will be celebrating this year. And I want to thank the director. I want to thank the wonderful team with whom I've already worked intensely. And I want to thank everybody who made this event possible. Without you, this would never have taken place. Thank you very much. And now, allow me to welcome you very cordially on behalf of the Herbert Foundation, and I want to invite our guests up on stage, Edward Hirsch, Michael Kruger, and Ryszard Krynicki.
Ed, Michael, I invited you to the stage, please. In the middle, you are here.
And I'm, as always, on the left.
You are on the... I thought you would be on the right, and Ryszard will be on the left. You are leaving.
You are on the right. Du bist rechts.
To dopiero... Ja... Brawo. Okay.
We rehearsed that.
I'm sure you did, of course. Chciałabym zacząć od przekazania
I would like to begin by conveying my regards, the regards from Katarzyna Herbert, who didn't feel well enough to attend this event, but she is following us online, and she is with us in spirit and in heart. She's very happy to be launching this Zbigniew Herbert Centennial tomorrow at the news conference, which will begin at noon in Teatr Polski. We will be presenting the outline of the ceremonies, and we will be announcing this year's winner of the Herbert Prize. All those interested are invited to Teatr Polski, to the small stage tomorrow. And now, it is my honor and pleasure to introduce our guests, a pleasure much greater since all three of them have been friends of the Herbert Foundation from day one, and Michael Kruger and Edward Hirsch have from the beginning been members of the jury of the award, and they are a great support to us. Edward Hirsch, poet, essayist, literary critic, comes from Chicago, born in Chicago, but a longtime resident of New York. Studied at Grinnell College in Iowa, gained his PhD at Penn State at the University of Pennsylvania. His first book of poems, For the Sleepwalkers, was published in 1981. And since then, he has published 10 volumes of poetry and 6 books of essays and prose. The 1999
How to Read a Poem and Fall in Love with Poetry, czyli, a pan tłumaczy, to ja już nie muszę, stała się autentycznym bestsellerem.
It became a bestseller. In Poland, two collections of poems translated by Maja Wodecka have been published, Wild Gratitude and Troubadour Song. Ed Hirsch has received many prizes and fellowships, including the MacArthur Fellowship, the Genius Grant, the Merrill Foundation Award, the Prix de Rome, and the award of the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Since 2002, he has been the president of the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation. Edward Hirsch, for many years, taught literature at American universities, including 17 years teaching the creative writing program at the University of Houston, Texas. As a professor, as an author of essays about poetry, he introduced American students to Polish poetry, and an expression of his interest in Polish poetry was a poetic seminar in Krakow that brought together young English language and Polish language poets that he established and ran together with Adam Zagajewski. One can say that Edward Hirsch is an apostle, an untiring apostle of Polish poetry in the United States, and we are very grateful and welcome, Ed. Michael Kruger is a German poet, prose writer, translator, literary critic, and publisher. He studied philosophy at the Freie Universität in Berlin. He made his poetic debut in 1972. His first book of poems, Originapoli, was published in 1976. He has published several dozen collections of poems, novels, short stories, and essays. A Polish-language translation of Die Cellospielerin has been published, and a collection of poems, Landscape with a Tree. In the years 2013-2019, he was the president of the Bavarian Academy of Art, and from 1968, he has been working with Hanser Verlag, publishing house. In 1985-2013, he was the director of that publishing house, where he published Polish poets, including Tadeusz Różewicz, Adam Zagajewski, and Ryszard Krynicki. He supported and continues to support publishing Zbigniew Herbert in Germany and other countries. He was a close friend of Herbert's, and we hope to hear some souvenirs, some recollections from Michael for his work, for his publications and work in culture and literature. He has been awarded the Toucan Prize, the Prix Medici d'Étranger, and the Federal Cross of Merit of the Republic of Germany. And also, Michael Kruger's work has been appreciated in Poland. He is the recipient of the award of the Foundation for Polish Culture. And we greatly appreciate everything he's done to promote Polish literature and Polish poets in Germany. Welcome, Michael. Ryszard Krynicki is a poet, translator, and publisher, a graduate of Polish philology at the Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań. His first book of poems was published in 1969 under the imprint of Wydawnictwo Poznańskie. He has published over a dozen books of poetry, but owing to his involvement with the dissident movement in the Polish People's Republic. In the years 1976-1980, there was a ban on publishing his work. He published in Samizdat and in Emigre magazines. Ryszard Krynicki, together with his wife, has for over 30 years been running the A5 publishing house, which specializes in poetry. He is interested primarily in German poetry, and he has translated numerous poems from the German, including Paul Celan and Nelly Sachs. Ryszard Krynicki has won numerous prizes, including the fact he is the only Polish winner of the Zbigniew Herbert International Literary Award, which he received in the year 2015. Yes, he does deserve a round of applause for that achievement. Katarzyna Herbert said at the ceremony, at the awards ceremony back in 2015, that Zbigniew and Ryszard shared there was a mysterious thread that continues to exist, uniting Ryszard and Zbigniew. Ryszard Krynicki published the works of Zbigniew Herbert, his collected poems, and 2 volumes of reconnaissance, so unpublished poems that had not been published in collections. And for the friendship you bore, Zbigniew Herbert, thank you very much, Ryszard, and thank you for being with us today. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the agenda is as follows. We will now be hearing 3 poems by Zbigniew Herbert, which will be read by Agata Buzek. Then we will ask our guests to deliver an introduction, some introductory remarks. Then we will hear 3 more poems by Zbigniew Herbert, and after which there will be a lively, I'm sure, discussion between the 3 poets we have here. So now it's over to Agata Buzek.
Włączony. Dobry wieczór. Nie włączony. Nie. Halo? Nie włączony. Działa, tak? Dobrze, bo tu nic nie słyszę. Okej. O, teraz słyszę. Tak. Dobrze. Dobry wieczór. Co widziałem? Widziałem proroków szarpiących przyprawione brody. Widziałem szalbierzy wstępujących do sekty biczowników. Oprawców przebranych w baranie skóry, którzy uchodzili przed gniewem ludu, grając na fujarce. Widziałem. Widziałem człowieka poddanego torturom. Siedział teraz bezpiecznie w gronie rodziny, opowiadał dowcipy, jadł zupę. Patrzyłem na jego rozchylone usta, dziąsła, 2 gałązki tarniny odarte z kory. Było to nad wyraz bezwstydne. Widziałem całą nagość, całe poniżenie. Potem akademia, dużo osób, kwiaty, duszno. Ktoś bez przerwy mówił o wypaczeniach. Myślałem o jego wypaczonych ustach. Czy to ostatni akt sztuki anonima, płaskiej jak całun, pełnej zduszonego szlochu i chichotu tych, którzy odsapnąwszy z ulgą, że znów się udało, Po uprzątnięciu martwych rekwizytów wolno podnoszą zbroczoną kurtynę. Apollo i Marsjasz. Właściwy pojedynek Apollona z Marsjaszem, słuch absolutny kontra ogromna skala, odbywa się pod wieczór, gdy, jak już wiemy, sędziowie przyznali zwycięstwo Bogu. Mocno przywiązany do drzewa, dokładnie odarty ze skóry, Marsjasz krzyczy. Zanim krzyk dojdzie do jego wysokich uszu, wypoczywa w cieniu tego krzyku. Wstrząsany dreszczem obrzydzenia, Apollo czyści swój instrument. Tylko z pozoru głos Marsjasza jest monotonny i składa się z jednej samogłoski A. W istocie opowiada Marsjasz nieprzebrane bogactwo swego ciała. Łyse góry wątroby, pokarmów białe wąwozy, szumiące lasy płuc, słodkie pagórki mięśni, stawy, żółć, krew i dreszcze, zimowy wiatr kości nad solą pamięci. Wstrząsany dreszczem obrzydzenia, Apollo czyści swój instrument. Teraz do chóru przyłącza się stos pacierzowy Marsjasza. W zasadzie to samo A, tylko głębsze z dodatkiem rdzy. To już jest ponad wytrzymałość Boga o nerwach z tworzyw sztucznych. Żwirową aleją, wysadzaną bukszpanem, odchodzi zwycięzca, zastanawiając się, czy z wycia Marsjasza nie powstanie z czasem nowa gałąź sztuki, powiedzmy, konkretnej. Nagle pod nogi upada mu skamieniały słowik. Odwraca głowę i widzi, że drzewo, do którego przywiązany był Marsjasz, jest siwe. Zupełnie. Pięciu. Wyprowadzają ich rano na kamienne podwórze i ustawiają pod ścianą. 5 mężczyzn, 2 bardzo młodych, pozostali w sile wieku. Nic więcej nie da się o nich powiedzieć. Kiedy Pluton podnosi broń do oka, wszystko nagle staje w jaskrawym świetle rzeczywistości. Żółty mur, zimny błękit, czarny drut na murze zamiast horyzontu. Jest to moment buntu 5 zmysłów, które rade by uciec, jak szczury z tonącego okrętu. Zanim kula dojdzie do miejsca przeznaczenia, oko zauważy nadlatujący pocisk, słuch utrwali stalowy szelest, nozdrza napełnią się ostrym dymem, muśnie podniebienie płatek krwi, a dotyk skurczy się i rozluźni. Teraz już leżą na ziemi, cieniem nakryci po oczy, pluton odchodzi, ich guziki, rzemienie i stalowe hełmy są bardziej żywe od tych leżących pod murem. Nie dowiedziałem się dzisiaj. Wiem o tym nie od wczoraj. Więc dlaczego pisałem nieważne wiersze o kwiatach? O czym mówiło 5 w nocy przed egzekucją? O snach proroczych, o przygodzie w burdelu, o częściach samochodu, o morskiej podróży, o tym, że jak miał piki, nie trzeba było zaczynać, o tym, że wódka najlepsza, po winie boli głowa, o dziewczynach, owocach, o życiu. A zatem można używać w poezji imion greckich pasterzy, można kusić się o utrwalenie barwy porannego nieba, pisać o miłości, a także jeszcze raz, ze śmiertelną powagą, ofiarować zdradzonemu światu róże.
I loved hearing these poems in Polish. Is it coming through? Yes. The song? I'm so glad to be with you. It's a privilege and an honor. I've never been called an apostle before. In 1968, Czesław Miłosz and Peter Dale Scott published Herbert's selected poems in English. Miłosz was first known as a political scientist in the U.S. for his work The Captive Mind and as a translator of Herbert. His own selected poems weren't published in the U.S. until 5 years later. Herbert's poems had an immediate impact in England and America. There was an introduction by A. Alvarez, which emphasized Herbert's political relevance, his courageous stand against the Soviet occupation. But that wasn't primarily what influenced American poets. It was Herbert's style, cool, precise, economical, anti-rhetorical. He dispensed with punctuation and eschewed grandiose effects. He took an ethical stand without resorting to poetic cliches, old-fashioned tropes. Herbert's cool classicism had an immediate impact on poets such as W.S. Merwin and Charles Simic, the first 2 recipients of the International Herbert Prize. My friend Larry Levis called Herbert a classical isle of sanity. I want to pause for a moment to say that Herbert spent a year teaching in Los Angeles for 1 year. My friend Larry was 24 and he drove Herbert around LA until Mrs. Herbert arrived and they bought a blue 4-door Fairlane sedan. Larry described how Mrs. Herbert drove while he sat in the front seat and Mr. Herbert sat in the back, making drawings, making comments, sending postcards. When they got onto the highway, Mrs. Herbert was so interested in what they were saying that she spoke to Larry in French and to her husband in Polish. But while she drove, she talked to him like this. It was as if the car drove itself. There were 2 kinds of poems that immediately impacted us. The first were Herbert's object poems, his rapacious love of the concrete, a fascination with inanimate objects. a duty to describe things from the outside. There was a kind of ethic of accuracy about it. Here's a line from Never About You. Don't be surprised we don't know how to describe the world and only speak to things affectionately by their first names. Or, I would like to describe the simplest emotion, joy or sadness, but not as others do, reaching for shafts of rain or sun. I would like to describe a light which is being born in me, but it does not resemble any star, for it is not so bright, not so pure, and it is uncertain. I myself responded tremendously to what Herbert would later call his uncertain clarity. Think of poems like Stool, Memory Will Speak, and the fidelity of things opens her eyes, A Knocker, Study of the Object, and especially the poem Pebble. In the late 60s and early 70s, there were a lot of stones rolling around in American poetry. Poets were trying to imbue the natural world with psyche. But Herbert's poem Pebble was different. To the poet who suffered under and seen the collapse of several shameful ideologies, his commitment to concrete particulars stood as a fundamental contrast and direct alternative to the cant and half-truths of human beings. The pebble is a perfect creature, equal to itself, mindful of its limits, filled exactly with a pebbly meaning. Herbert contrasted the objective ethics of the stony world, the ardor and coldness, which is just and full of dignity, with the injustice of the human world. He found a deceptively angular way to write about politics and human compromise. There was also a second kind of poem, because Herbert was an avant-garde classicist. He was the most ironic, civilized, and classically conscious of poets. Figures such as Marcus Aurelius and Hamlet, Roman proconsuls and Greek gods appeared in his poems. Miłosz called it a poetry of historical irony, the way he continually confronted his own experience and juxtaposed it with the experience of the past, seeking the grounds for what he called universal compassion. So it turns out that Herbert was not a phenomenological poet per se, but a poet of thought, which was proved later by the Mr. Cogito poems. He was self-conscious, self-questioning, philosophically aware, a tragic post-Cartesian attracted to Erasmus, to Dutch art. It was reading Herbert that I began to understand that there is a dialogue in Polish poetry between an interest in history and an interest in metaphysics. What I mean by this is most political poets around the world, say the political poets of Latin America, are entirely conscious of writing politically and historically, with much less interest in things like the nature of art or the quality of music or universal truths. I discovered this feeling first about Herbert's work, then about Polish poetry in general, which distinguished it, because it struck me as a historical poetry that wanted really to be a metaphysical poetry, wanted to ask these larger questions. And I want to prove this to you with a wonderful sort of catalog of things in the poem Mr. Cogito and the Imagination. Here there's a sort of catalog of subject rhymes of what Mr. Cogito wants to understand to the very end. And then listen to the nature of these things. Pascal's night, the nature of a diamond, the melancholy of the prophets, Achilles' wrath, the madness of those who kill, the dreams of Mary Stuart, Neanderthal fear, the despair of the last Aztecs, Nietzsche's long death throes, the joy of the painter at Lascaux, The rise and fall of an oak. The rise and fall of Rome. So Pascal's night, what is it in the starry spaces? Is there a God between the stars or is there not? It's a kind of gamble. This was called Pascal's wager. The melancholy of the prophets because they know what's going to happen. Achilles' wrath, this tremendous rage that takes over him over the death of Patroclus. The madness of those who kill, those who are so taken over by rage that they kill others. But then the dreams of Mary Stuart, a woman who, what's she thinking about, what's she dreaming about before she's executed? Neanderthal fear, this primal fear and terror when you know you're going to be dying. Hence, the despair of the last Aztecs, not just a single person like Mary Stuart, but everyone, a whole tribe. What does it feel like when you know that your entire people is going to be eliminated? And then Nietzsche's long death throes. Do you remember that Nietzsche went mad because he saw the terrible agony of a horse being whipped in the street and he couldn't stand it? And then Herbert juxtaposes this to the joy of the painter at Lascaux. I mean, what was that? The very first painter, the very first one to make a mark in a cave of an animal moving. What kind of joy was that? And then the rise and fall of an oak, the natural rhythm of things, the rise and falling of things. And then the rise and fall of Rome, the natural rhythm, rise and fall of a civilization. So we're thinking here about victims, individual and collective. We're also thinking about the nature of religious faith and the miracle of nature. We're thinking of the rage of some that leads to the despair of others, the horrors of history, the primal despair of those on the point of extinction. But we also want to meditate on the mysteries of creation and the joys of artistic creativity. This is why Herbert's great project, the great imaginative imperative, a desire to bring the dead back to life, to preserve the covenant, is so important. He keeps human suffering in view. He's faithful to what we know and what we don't know, to uncertain clarity. He's a model of integrity and a hero of consciousness, unwavering in his humanity. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Do you want?
Is this one? Well, it's better to have it here. It looks like a torch. Well, good evening. I was asked to tell you a little bit about Zbigniew's presence in Germany and in Europe. And so I want to start with my first, when I first saw him. That was exactly the year Ed started, 68, when in Berlin there was a series of lectures of international poets called Ein Gedicht und sein Autor, a poem and its author, and invited from Poland were a certain Mr. Herbert and another one called Tadeusz Różewicz. And the two guys, not the highest, not the biggest people in the world, both of them spoke German, and both of them presented a very different kind of poetical imagination. Here, The one from Gliwice, at that time he lived in Gliwice, with his totally ascetic poetry of avoiding metaphors, avoiding pictures, etc., only to describe the tortured language. And on the other side, this man with a wonderful hair, you know, like it was beautiful to observe the two people I never have seen before, I never have heard before. And when Różewicz spoke, Herbert smiled a little bit, and well, you felt that you have two sides of poetical enterprise. Anyway, when I heard the poems we just heard here from the actress from Herbert and his little speech, I was totally convinced. I was 20 years old. I was totally convinced that, or 22, let's say, I don't want to lie about my... I was totally convinced that I met one of those Weltgeist poetry, that one of the greatest poets of our time. And the funny thing was that next day, so I went home totally convinced that I was following 1 hour of great poetry. I went next day. I went around the little village we lived near Berlin, and suddenly I saw a man with 2 nets full of bottles, water, but also some other things I've forgotten. Most probably it was a red fluid thing, most probably wine. And so it was Zbigniew who lived there around the corner in a house which belonged to the German academic exchange program. And so he lived there with Katrinchen for some months. Anyway, I asked that man if I could help him with the nets, with all that bottles, and he said, yes, you can. And he gave me both nets. So he went in front, and I had to follow him with his huge, awful, heavy nets with water and wine, and don't ask me what else. Anyway, so began a friendship, by the way, with both of them. Both of them were translated by a man you probably have heard of, or the specialists have heard of, Karl Dedecius, from Lodz, who lived in Munich, where I used to work then, and was working for a huge insurance company, and in the evenings he translated Polish poetry, beginning with the poetry and the aphorisms of Stanisław Jerzy, which was a huge success in Germany, and even politicians used to quote him. And so he got famous. It was the Allianz insurance company. It's like the Kafka and his company, so Karol was for Allianz. And whenever you saw him, he had a huge office. He was sitting there and reading technical things, but underneath he had the poetry of Zbigniew Herbert, Różewicz, and others in preparation. Anyway, this Karl Dedecius, which was one of much more than any other politician, did a lot for the transfer of Polish and German literature, and he is the one who started years later the Polish Institute in Darmstadt, near Frankfurt, where from Weizsäcker to other people. Everybody was on the board, and it was a big thing, also not only for the poetry, but also for Polish studies after the Second World War. So Zbigniew published first a book of his essays on paintings and travel pieces, and then came the first book from which we heard these poems, Inschrift, inscription, or whatever it is in Polish, the first book. And the influence you could not only feel, but you could read. So this book became so famous among German younger poets that everybody knew somehow by heart some of Wenn sie Prokonsul, for example, or Nike, Wenn sie zögert, Nike, when she is, you know it better. You know, when her arm is always in the air, this wonderful poem. You know, everybody knew it in the community of poets, of course. And so his influence was very strong, but everybody confessed that he has read this Inschrift, this first wonderful produced for a first book of poems by a foreign author. Probably you have it here in the exhibition. It was a beautiful produced book. So everybody felt that you have to have that wonderful book. Anyway, that was published with Suhrkamp, a famous publisher of German and international literature. And so book after book, he published all his stuff with Suhrkamp. Always the poetry translated by Karol Dedecius, the prose by different people. And so for some reasons or others, you know better, political reasons, he lived quite a long time in Germany, different times and different places. And he became a kind of a Polish writer living in Germany. And so he became a member first of the Deutsche Akademie, the German Academy of Arts and Letters, and then of the Bavarian Academy and various other things. And from the beginning, almost, he got literary prizes, which was also rare at that time, that foreign authors got the big literary prizes, like the Herder Prize and the prize of the Austrian Academy, and so on and so on. And I was on the jury of a very funny prize called Petrarca. And for 20 years, we went to places in Italy where Petrarca used to live and work, Italy and France. And first of all, we gave one of the first prizes to Zbigniew, and he came with his wife, a wonderful wife, because he always had to have somebody who's keeping the nets, you know. And I never will forget that, looking out of the window in a hotel in Padua, and the small and fragile Katrinchen went in front with two huge cases, and Zbigniew tried to follow her without anything to carry. And so he became a very close friend of ours, and so I asked him to come to be a member of the jury, what he did. So we had for some years our meetings and our meetings in Munich or in Paris or in Italy. And he always came, and since he knew so much about Renaissance painting and Renaissance culture, he was one of our best guides also in these cities. Nothing was better and more beautiful than to go with him to the museum. And I always tell this funny story that I don't know if somebody of you know the Munich Pinakothek, the famous Pinakothek, with a huge staircase, about, let's say, 80 or 90 stairs. So he asked me one day, he was living with me in my apartment, and he asked me, why don't we go to the museum Sunday morning at 9? We are the first, and we have all the pictures only for us. And so we went there, and we tried to climb up the stairs. After 10 stairs, he said, we go down for a moment to have a cigarette. The next time we came to stair 20, then he said, I really have to go back, one more cigarette. So anyway, after the fourth attempt to get up the stair, the director came and saw him and remembered him and said, well, aren't you Mr. Herbert? And, yes. Why don't you take our elevator? We have a wonderful elevator. It costs 2 million marks, and we don't have to go up. But Zbigniew insisted, and that is one of those stories I really like. He insisted on going himself to the pictures. I don't use these funny electronic things. I mean, I don't have to tell you that he never had an electronic telephone and things like that. So Zbigniew became, to answer the question of Marisha, he became a part of this intellectual, poetical community in 3 towns. First in Berlin, where he used to live for quite a long time. Second in Frankfurt, where his publisher was established. And third in Munich. In Munich, at the academy, he was not only a member of the academy, but had a lot of readings. And in the radio, he made different programs in the radio station, and etc. So he was. We felt, seeing him, we felt that he somehow belonged to us. For me, this was a special thing because I couldn't imagine when I was young, when I was 18, when I made my matura, I couldn't imagine that a Polish writer is coming without to be forced to Germany. It was for me a wonder. So over the time, I met and published a lot of Polish authors and saw a lot of them. And I always asked the question, why the hell you don't go the normal way to Western Europe, and that means take a plane to Paris. There was Cultura, there was the group around the bookshop, and why Germany? And one reason is that Różewicz, but also Zbigniew told me that, yes, we want to know what it is about the culture, and Ed did it in much more educated way. but they wanted to find out what it's about this German culture, which has this both sides. And so after Ryszard Krynicki published this fantastic volume with all his poems, and Surkamp was working on the German edition of this fantastic book, I discovered, when I moved out of the apartment to another one, I discovered this long poem written by Zbigniew and dedicated to me, which is more or less never published. It was handwritten, which is more or less a long meditation on the question why it was so difficult to come to Germany and why it felt better every day he was with us. So he's addressing us, Michael, Peter, etc. So when I saw that in the Polish edition he gave to me of this little book he published with Kultura, Tales from a Besieged City, also forgotten the title. Yeah, Report, right. It fell out. So he was, when he was living with me, he wrote it and put it in a book and forgot the book, and it was in Polish, I couldn't read it, so I put it on the shelf. And when I was moving it, I got out and the poem were on the floor. So this was the end of the story with my story with Zbigniew. Not the end, but this poem asking himself and asking us why is this German culture has these two totally different faces. Already in the 70s, I made the first collection of from all of his work, essays and poetry, published in this Polnische Bibliothek, Polish library, edited by Dedecius, which was a groundbreaking work of he did, and there were only from the living only three poets. That was Tadeusz Różewicz, Zbigniew. I did the selection and an anthology. Very important anthology, by the way. And that was the presentation of the whole Polish literature from the beginning, very beautiful and done and very learned commentaries and prefaces and so on. So he was now one of those. And since I published in the last 30 years also Czesław Miłosz, Ryszard Krynicki, Tadeusz. So I had all these Polish poets not under my wings. It sounds like I'm an angel, but I'm not an angel. I'm under on the table. Let's say. Let's put it like that. So for me, it was quite natural to read that and to try to understand what they are writing. And now I'm old and out of business, and so I'm able to look back. And what I can say is, and that is for all the people I mentioned, that they, in a certain way, and you mentioned his irony, this wonderful irony. I mean, I never will forget that, sitting with him somewhere in a restaurant, and I mean, how he spoke, and in this very peculiar way and very wonderful way. His irony was breathtaking. And even in the first book, Inscription, you have some of those ironic passages, like this piece on chicken. Chicken somehow reminded him of certain poets, and you know. Anyway, so I think that the Polish literature has influenced the European poetry much more than, let's say, the great Italian poetry, which was also influential, especially with Ungaretti and Montale. Not so the French anymore, despite Bonnefoy, but the Polish poetry, and especially the people I mentioned, were, well, let's say, the salt in the soup. And so I'm grateful to sit here, and I'm grateful that Katrinchen is still alive and will probably listen to us over the micro. And I was yesterday, I've seen her yesterday, and she's like a little bird. And it was wonderful to see her with Ryszard. So it is a part of my life.
Dobry wieczór Państwu.
Good evening. I don't have such vivid and colorful stories to tell as my wonderful co-panelists. And perhaps I'll begin. Let me just add, let me just follow up on what Mikhail just said. Because he often he did mention Inscription, the book of poems that was published in Germany in 1967. As you remember, there is a book of poems by Herbert that is called Inscription, but the two books are actually different. They're different collections, they're different books, because the German Inscription was published earlier, and it was a selection of Herbert's poems that was edited and translated by Karl Dedecius. It was a selection of poems written over 10 years, but the Polish book of poems, Inscription, which came out 2 years later, contained newer poems. And that was often, it was often the case that Herbert's poems were published in translation earlier, especially into the German, translated by Karl Dedecius.
ukazywały się znacznie.
They were published earlier in translation than they were in the original Polish.
Za życia Herberta
In Herbert's lifetime, some poems hadn't been published at all. Some
w Polsce
weren't available in Poland for reasons of obviously censorship. So
tutaj dla
for a scholar of poetry, of Herbert's poetry, the archive, the Dedecius archive, is very important as it contains a lot of manuscripts
wierszy,
and of poems that Herbert had entrusted or had sent to Dedecius. The archive is based in Słubice and in Frankfurt on the Oder.
tak. Pani
Maria Dzieduszycka mentioned that
że ja wydałem
had published
tom rozproszony.
a volume of his unpublished, uncollected works called Reconnaissance,
Były dwa wydania.
and it had two editions. It had two editions.
I to jest rzecz, która mnie od dawna zajmuje.
And it's something that's occupied me for a long time, that I'm trying to
Wiersze Zbigniewa
decipher Herbert's poems
nie ukończył.
that he never completed, that he had never published, And this collection, the Reconnaissance, contains these scattered works, including the poem that Michael mentioned, the poem that was dedicated to him. It was called To Michael Kruger. That's the title of the poem. And poems that need to be deciphered, that remain to be deciphered by Herbert, there's many of them still, so future publishers of the collected works of a critical edition will have their work cut out. Because Herbert's ever is immense, what's been published so far, what he managed to publish in his lifetime, is barely the tip of the iceberg compared to what he produced, what he had wanted to write and publish. And what can be deciphered, what can be found in manuscript in his notebooks. Because Herbert was very punctilious, he wrote down everything, all his observations. He was very diligent and also made notes. So since I had the opportunity to read those manuscripts, I see how extensive the work was, how he envisaged it, and I see it as a work in progress. I still see it as a work in progress. because I continue to decipher, to read, to find new things there. Herbert often Herbert would often start working on a book or a series of poems or texts, which he later, for some reason, would abandon, not complete. There's a series of works called Characters, and that's the title, Characters, or the works, the poems themselves, somehow correspond to the characters of Zofia Naukowska and Polish, and the Theophrastes and the Champhore. So some of these texts were published by Herbert in the 1950s, but then he abandoned it, the project. There's a few texts that remain in manuscript. Some of them I've been able to decipher and publish, and some of them remain to be read, or so that's one of Herbert's abandoned series that were abandoned halfway. There's a book, there's a mysterious notebook, a notebook from the late 40s, a copybook, a notebook called Journal Métaphysique, with the mysterious title of Journal Métaphysique, which I was unable, of course I'm very interested, but I was unable to extract anything much from it, because those were texts written in pencil, and over the years it faded. They faded, so you'd need some sort of technical method to decipher. Yes, it is truly a metaphysical problem. Since I am publishing Zbigniew Herbert's poems, and being privy, being able to read his poems in manuscript, when I was publishing successive editions of his poems, I try to cleanse, I try to remove typos and errors and gremlins and glitches that you find sometimes in books published in his lifetime. Some of these misprints were corrected by Herbert in books that he would give to his friends. But for some reason, in later editions, In later editions of his poems, of his collected poems, these corrections had not been introduced. And I think that these misprints need to be corrected, and I'm trying to do that successively in successive editions. Let me read you a text, a poem, which perpetuates a misprint, where a misprint exists ever since the first edition. This is Hermes, the Dog, and the Star. As you recall, it consists of two parts. The first are poems, and then you have poetic prose. You have like poems in prose, as we might call them today. And one of these is called it's a poem in prose, a Prosagedicht, as the Germans would say, which is called After the Concert. I'll read it in the version that it was published in and continued to be published in. After the concert, above the symphony's severed head still hangs the iron sword of the tutti. The empty music stands are like bare stems from which a cantilena has fallen, petal by petal. You see three levels of silence: the church, like a cooling barrel of thunder, a clutch of basses sleeping against the wall like drunken peasants, and lower down, all the way down, a wooden curlicue shaved off by a bow. So as you noticed, there's three musical instruments mentioned in this piece, but then all of a sudden you see the word church, the church like a barrel of thunder, which sticks out, which doesn't fit. So first, the odd man out. So first I thought, before I knew the manuscript, I thought that perhaps the concert had taken place in a church, and the church is where the music reverberates, and the church is a cooling barrel of thunder. But, as I said, the church was, again, it sticks out, it doesn't really fit in with the other instruments, because as Herbert wrote in his poem, Mr. Cogito and the Imagination, which Ed quoted just now, Mr. Cogito never trusted the tricks of the imagination. A piano on the summit of the Alps played a rang false, sorry for the ad-lib. So there was something wrong, something was funny here in this text, and only after I was able to read the manuscript in one of his notebooks that I noticed that it clearly says not church, kościół, but kocioł, which is kettle drum. Kessel, right? Not kościół, kocioł. And that's what you have in the manuscript. And you also have it in a series of poems in prose by Zbigniew Herbert, which he called Fables, because that was what he called the series at first. So in a book in manuscript, which Herbert wrote in 1953, it was called Fables, and there were many texts that would later be published in in Hermes, the Dog and the Star. So he gave the notebook to a close friend of his for his name day, to his close friend Tadeusz Chrzanowski. It's a little book in manuscript that's very painstakingly, very carefully drawn up, written by Herbert. And in that book, you have this piece called After the Concert, and it clearly says Kocioł, K-O-C-I-O-L, not K-O-S-C-I-O-L. So here it's beyond a doubt. And like I said, Herbert would corrected the misprint in later editions, but this correction was never actually introduced by him. I did that in an edition of his selected works in 2008, and since then, ever since, I've been trying also to remove any misprints that I chance upon. There's over a dozen of these that I'm aware of. Misprints have a life of their own. So this poem, this piece after the concert, in the National Library edition, published under the imprint of Ossolineum. So this misprint continues to be present. So I hope that in later editions this will be rectified.
Kamyk.
The pebble.
Kamyk jest stworzeniem doskonałym, równy samemu sobie, pilnujący swych granic, wypełniony dokładnie kamiennym sensem, o zapachu, który niczego nie przypomina, niczego nie płoszy, nie budzi pożądania. Jego zapał i chłód są słuszne i pełne godności. Czuję ciężki wyrzut, kiedy go trzymam w dłoni i ciało jego szlachetne przenika fałszywe ciepło. Kamyki nie dają się oswoić. Do końca będą na nas patrzeć okiem spokojnym, bardzo jasnym. Pan Kogito i wyobraźnia. Pan Kogito nigdy nie ufał sztuczkom wyobraźni. Fortepian na szczycie Alp grał mu fałszywe koncerty. Nie cenił labiryntów, sfinks napawał go odrazą. Mieszkał w domu bez piwnic, luster i dialektyki. Dżungle skłębionych obrazów nie były jego ojczyzną. Unosił się rzadko na skrzydłach metafory. Potem spadał jak ikar w objęcia wielkiej matki. Uwielbiał tautologię. Tłumaczenie idem per idem, że ptak jest ptakiem, niewola niewolą, nóż jest nożem, śmierć śmiercią. Kochał płaski horyzont, linię prostą, przyciąganie ziemi. Pan Cogito będzie zaliczony do gatunku minores. Obojętnie przyjmie wyrok przyszłych badaczy litery. Używał wyobraźni do całkiem innych celów. Chciał z niej uczynić narzędzie współczucia. Pragnął pojąć do końca noc Pascala, naturę diamentu, melancholię proroków, gniew Achillesa, szaleństwa ludobójców, sny Mary Stuart, strach neandertalski, rozpacz ostatnich Azteków, długie konanie niczego, radość malarza z Lascaux, wzrost i upadek dębu, wzrost i upadek Rzymu. Zatem ożywiać zmarłych, dochować przymierza. Wyobraźnia pana Cogito ma ruch wahadłowy. Przebiega precyzyjnie od cierpienia do cierpienia. Nie ma w niej miejsca na sztuczne ognie poezji. Chciałby pozostać wierny niepewnej jasności. Przesłanie pana Cogito. Idź dokąd poszli tamci, do ciemnego kresu, po złote runo nicości, twoją ostatnią nagrodę. Idź wyprostowany wśród tych, co na kolanach, wśród odwróconych plecami i obalonych w proch. Ocalałeś nie po to, aby żyć. Masz mało czasu, trzeba dać świadectwo. Bądź odważny, gdy rozum zawodzi, bądź odważny. W ostatecznym rachunku jedynie to się liczy. A gniew twój bezsilny niech będzie jak morze, ilekroć usłyszysz głos poniżonych i bitych. Niech nie opuszcza cię twoja siostra pogarda. Dla szpiclów, katów, tchórzy oni wygrają. Pójdą na twój pogrzeb i z ulgą rzucą grudę, a kornik napisze twój uładzony życiorys. I nie przebaczaj, zaiste nie w twojej to mocy przebaczać w imieniu tych, których zdradzono o świcie. Strzeż się jednak dumy niepotrzebnej. Oglądaj w lustrze swą błazeńską twarz. Powtarzaj, zostałem powołany, czyż nie było lepszych. Strzeż się oschłości serca, kochaj źródło zaranne. Ptaka o nieznanym imieniu, dąb zimowy. Światło na murze, splendor nieba. One nie potrzebują twego ciepłego oddechu. Są po to, aby mówić, nikt cię nie pocieszy. Czuwaj, kiedy światło na górach daje znak, wstań i idź, dopóki krew obraca w piersi twoją ciemną gwiazdę. Powtarzaj stare zaklęcia ludzkości, bajki i legendy, bo tak zdobędziesz dobro, którego nie zdobędziesz. Powtarzaj wielkie słowa, powtarzaj je z uporem, jak ci, co szli przez pustynię i ginęli w piasku. A nagrodzą cię za to tym, co mają pod ręką, chłostą śmiechu, zabójstwem na śmietniku. Idź, bo tylko tak będziesz przyjęty do grona zimnych czaszek, do grona twoich przodków, Gilgamesza, Hektora, Rolanda, obrońców Królestwa bez kresu i miasta popiołów. Bądź wierny, idź. Dziękuję Państwu bardzo.
We thought we might have a little conversation about poetry and then about Herbert's poetry and then open it up to questions from the audience. Is that? Next Sunday, we'll all go to pray at the kettle drum based on our misprint. I wonder, I'd like to ask Ryszard and Michal a question, which is, it seems to me that for someone who was so eloquent as a poet, there's something in Herbert that's very anti-romantic. And the reason I say that is just listening to Mr. Cogito and the Imagination. Right at the beginning, he says that he distrusts the piano at the top. Whoa, that's very exciting. He distrusts the piano at the top of the Alps, which is a wonderful image from Rimbaud, who loves the piano at the top of the Alps, which is an image of the sublime. And I'm very struck that Herbert doesn't like that. And he also doesn't like what he calls the artificial fires of poetry, which I think many of us in poetry do love. That would be, say, the great poetry of Mallarmé, which is really the artificial fires of poetry. There's language doing all kinds of things symbolically without a very clear referent. And I wonder if you think there's something of the anti-poet in Herbert's eloquent poetry.
Well, if you make this decision that there is on the one side the romantic idea of poetry and on the other side the constructive part, then probably he's much more on the romantic side. But Zbigniew was too intelligent to produce just the fires of poetry, or what you call it. He was too intelligent to let him be a poet. He always was a rational man and who could talk about philosophy, talk about art history, talk about even history itself. So it was only in his later years, in my opinion, but it may be wrong, he changed from more and more. He was so melancholic about Polish problems, what I always call the Polish headaches. He got so melancholic and so triste about that he sometimes, I had the impression that he wanted to get rid of all that. but he couldn't get rid of it. You know, it followed him like a second skin, and he was unable to live in L.A. Probably, I mean, you had this conversation, what I had after his coming back, that they offered him a job for quite a long time, and like Miłosz and Adam and others and Baranczak. But he said, it's impossible for me to live there. It's impossible. I have to smell this part of the world where I was born, plus Italy and the golden age of the Dutch painting. Well, the best thing I can say about his poetry is that he neither belongs to this side nor to the other, and that he chose Mr. Cogito was his statement. We have to be Mr. Cogito, but we have to also to ask what that means. There is no cogito in history. There is no cogito in the relation of people. There is no etc., etc. So he was getting more and more and more and more melancholic and more depressive. And he tried to kill that feelings, sometimes with a lot of alcohol. And I remember very well, probably it's not a direct answer to your question, but I remember very well when he really got mad about Herr Dedecius. That was his translator for all these years. And at a certain point, he mistrusted everybody. He said, well, he is not working correctly. And he forced me to ring up all his publishers in the world at a time when a telephone was really expensive. He was sitting in my apartment, and he tried to find in New York somebody at Echo Press. The man never was at his desk, but he was waiting on the telephone and saying, well, I have to wait here. So but that was also a kind of very, 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 very triste situation. It was not a joke for him. He was in a very bad situation, let's put it like that. So I think for him it was not a question of this or that. He was trying to combine the whole thing for once together. And I'm very interested in what Ryszard said, that there is still a lot of stuff unpublished in his notebooks, and probably there we will find the answer. Because what you said is very important. Inscription, Inschrift, the first book of poems, was a selection of all what he has done. And most probably this Dedecius, Karol, made the selection together with Zbigniew, but also, I knew him very well. Also probably he said, well, that is not so good for the German ear or market or publisher. Let's better take that. And so Dedecius was very influential. When he said, we publish this and not that, that was a law. The law of Dedecius. And he was very vain in a way that he wanted to present his picture of Polish literature. Anyway, I can't answer your question really properly, but he was not on the Valéry side and not of the Mallarmé side, and of course not on the side of a political poetry, whatever that is. but his kind of imagination was something very special and in between, and I think that is a reason why we still read him and still get in another state by reading him. For example, the Cogito, it's a very good example. This 85, we have published 85, also in Germany is published 85 Cogito poems. And if you read them one after the other, the whole series, you have so many different views on the world that the phrase cogito ergo sum is only one side of the Mr. Cogito of Zbigniew Herbert.
Do you want to say anything about Herbert as a possible anti-poet or not?
I think that Herbert's poetry, that Ed Hirsch defined Herbert's poetry very well, described it very well, when you said that Herbert was an avant-garde classicist. That's a paradox, but I think that it's a very that's a very good description of the nature of the character of that poetry. The beginnings, the poetic, his beginnings as a poet. So he started off as in the avant-garde, the second avant-garde specifically. The second avant-garde, such as Józef Czechowicz, a Polish poet, about whom Herbert would write in the 1950s. So the second avant-garde was the 1930s. And Herbert wrote an essay about this Polish poet from Lublin. Naturally, it wasn't just Czechowicz. Above all, first of all, the classics of the Polish avant-garde, like Julian Przyboś, whom Herbert also wrote about, and Tadeusz Piper, called the Pope of the avant-garde in Poland in his day.
I just wanted to add one line to your idea of the misprints. I think that there is creation of sense through misprints. I just read a big book about Max Weber, the sociologist, and the printer, from the first chapter on, changed his name into Marx Weber. So I thought that was a very good idea. The printer corrected the author, but in a very obvious and good way. Marx Weber.
I'm surrounded by two publishers. I'm getting very frightened. Low to the misprint. Let's open it up to the audience and see if anyone has any any questions for us?
Well, we are celebrating right now the 100th death date of Franz Kafka. And I always was very, very fond of, and we celebrated it with a book of his drawings. I don't know if it's published also in Poland. But a huge book with all the drawings of Kafka. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful book. And I thought, and that was my suggestion yesterday, I thought one should here decide to make an edition of Zbigniew's drawings. I think he was...
Isn't there?
No.
Isn't there? There's not a book of his drawings? No, but not really. Sort of.
Not a proper book with his drawings, because I think when you ever have seen him standing in front of the big pictures, painting, and what he got out of the pictures in his little drawings was the essence, sometimes the essence of the whole thing. And I really love his drawings, and I think one should do a proper book out of that, because it's a footnote also to his poetry.
When I was giving a lecture once at the University of Alaska, I asked if there were any questions, and there were none, so I started saying, well, Professor Hirsch, I have a question for you.
Informally.
Good idea.
We can continue informally with a glass of wine. It will be easier to ask questions to three of you, because you may be a little intimidating for some people.
I'm scared of us too.
Eddie.
Perhaps now we should, we have it to conclude a recording of Herbert reading his poem, Report from the Besieged City. And one thing I would like to say is that it's the 75th anniversary of the uprising in Tibet, the fleeing of the Dalai Lama. And we're all aware, I think daily, in a brutal way, of how many besieged cities there are in Ukraine now. And this poem has a tremendous relevance to the moment that we're in. Several of Herbert's poems, like Mr. Cogito reads the newspaper, feel as if they were written this morning. They're so relevant to our present situation.
Taki wiersz, raport oblężonego miasta. Zbyt stary, żeby nosić broń i walczyć jak inni, wyznaczono mi z łaski pośrednią rolę kronikarza. Zapisuję nie wiadomo dla kogo dzieje oblężenia. Mam być dokładny, ale nie wiem, kiedy zaczął się najazd. Przed 200 laty, w grudniu, wrześniu, może wczoraj o świcie. Wszyscy chorują tutaj na zanik poczucia czasu. Pozostało nam tylko miejsce, przywiązanie do miejsca. Jeszcze dzierżymy ruiny świątyń, widma ogrodów i domów. Jeśli stracimy ruiny, nie pozostanie nic. Piszę tak, jak potrafię, w rytmie nieskończonych tygodni. Poniedziałek, magazyny puste, jednostką obiegową stał się Szczur. Wtorek, burmistrz zamordowany przez niewiadomych sprawców. Środa, rozmowa o zawieszeniu broni. Nieprzyjaciel internował posłów, nie znamy ich miejsca pobytu, to znaczy miejsca kaźni. Czwartek, po burzliwym zebraniu odrzucono większością głosów wniosek kupców o bezwarunkowej kapitulacji. Piątek, początek dżumy. Sobota, popełnił samobójstwo NN, niezłomny obrońca. Niedziela, nie ma wody, oparliśmy szturm przy bramie wschodniej, zwanej Bramą Przymierza. Wiem, monotonne to wszystko, nikogo nie zdoła poruszyć. Unikam komentarzy, emocje trzymam w karbach, piszę o faktach, podobno tylko one ceniono są na rynkach obcych. Ale z niejaką dumą pragnę donieść światu, że wyhodowaliśmy dzięki wojnie nową odmianę dzieci. Nasze dzieci nie lubią bajek, bawią się w zabijanie. Na jawie i we śnie marzą o zupie, chlebie i kości, zupełnie jak psy i koty. Wieczorem lubię wędrować po rubieżach miasta wzdłuż granic naszej niepewnej wolności. Patrzę z góry na mrowie wojsk, ich światła, słucham hałasu bębnów, barbarzyńskich wrzasków. Doprawdy niepojęte, że miasto jeszcze się broni. Oblężenie trwa długo, wrogowie muszą się zmieniać. Nic ich nie łączy poza pragnieniem naszej zagłady. Goci, Tatarzy, Szwedzi, chówce cesarza, pułki przemienienia pańskiego, kto ich policzy? Kolory sztandarów zmieniają się jak las na horyzoncie, od delikatnej ptasiej żółci na wiosnę, przez zieleń, czerwień do zimowej czerni. Wtedy wieczorem uwolniony od faktów mogę pomyśleć o sprawach dawnych, dalekich, na przykład o naszych sprzymierzeńcach za morzem. Wiem, współczują szczerze, ślą mąkę, worki, otuchy, tłuszcz i dobre rady. Nie wiedzą nawet, że nas zdradzili ich ojcowie, nasi byli alianci z czasów drugiej apokalipsy. Synowie są bez win, zasługują na wdzięczność, więc jesteśmy wdzięczni. Nie przeżyli długiego jak wieczność oblężenia. Ci, których dotknęło nieszczęście, są zawsze samotni. Obrońcy dalej Lamy, Kurdowie, afgańscy górale. Teraz, kiedy piszę te słowa, zwolennicy ugody zdobyli pewną przewagę nad stronnictwem niezłomnych, zwykłe wahanie nastrojów. Losy jeszcze się ważą. Cmentarze rosną, maleje liczba obrońców, ale obrona trwa i będzie trwała do końca. Jeśli miasto padnie, a ocaleje jeden, on będzie niósł miasto w sobie po drogach wygnania, on będzie miasto. Patrzymy w twarz głodu, twarz ognia, twarz śmierci, najgorszą ze wszystkich twarz zdrady. I tylko sny nasze nie zostały upokorzone.
Ed, Michał, Ryszard, thank you very much. Bardzo dziękujemy za tę rozmowę.
Thank you very much for this talk, and I think it was a great beginning, a great opening of the Herbert Centennial. You might not know that Katarzyna Herbert was listening to you online, Katrinchen. So thank you very much, and now join us for a talk over a glass of wine.